So today we're going to be talking about FEMA's guidance on agriculture and accessory structures in your special flood hazard area. As we saw in the previous poll question, this is going to be a very important topic for a lot of you. And I'm sure you're all excited to learn about this area of floodplain management. It's relatively new within the last couple of years, and this is the first it's being taught on this virtual setting for Nebraskans from NEDNR. So I hope you all learned something today. We're going to be talking about a few different things. So we've already covered our welcome and introductions. But next, we're going to introduce the concept. We're going to talk about FEMA's definitions and what this means for Nebraskans. I'll introduce the concept, why it's important, and we'll talk about some of the actual defining characteristics of agricultural and accessory structures. And then we're going to talk about the actual permitting process for both types of structures and what that may look like. We'll look at some examples of each and see, we'll apply that definition. Then we'll talk about wet floodproofing requirements. So this is kind of the biggest part of all of this new guidance, is that agricultural and accessory structures in their own ways are allowed to be wet floodproofed. And so we're going to be talking about wet floodproofing requirements for those and how to apply that. And lastly, another large part of some of this guidance is considering and granting variances. We're going to talk about that, and we'll get into that later on. We'll touch on it a few times, but we'll really dive into it at the end. So like I said, we want to introduce this concept first. We'll talk about the basics and we'll set up our foundation before diving into the material. So this is in the context of FEMA's understanding of agricultural and accessory structures. I'm going to introduce the definitions of each. I'll offer FEMA's official guidance documents and where to access those, as well as the different regulations and why the guidance was produced in the first place. Starting off, I felt like this was going to be a crucial definition. All of these definitions, I'm going to mention these words a bunch of different times throughout this presentation. So I wanted to start by just very basic, explaining what development means. As we all know, any development in the floodplain does require a floodplain permit, but what is development? It's any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, including but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation or drilling operations, or storage of equipment or materials. And there's a lot there, but essentially what we're saying is any man-made change to those properties or to any man-made change in the floodplain is going to trigger a floodplain development permit. And this is how we define development. We also wanted to establish what a structure is, and the surefire way to define a structure is it is a walled and roofed building that is principally above ground. So for example, if this is a structure that has a roof that is completely secured, but it doesn't have any walls, maybe something like a gazebo or a park shelter, it's not technically considered a structure under this definition because there's no walls. The same applies if it's like an animal pen where it doesn't have a roof, but maybe it has walls or gates around it. It's not a structure, right? So it's important that we understand. I'm going to mention the term structure a few times. It's important to understand what I'm talking about. So here we define agricultural structure. Now there's a lot more to this definition than what is shown on this slide. Like I said, we'll get into the technicalities of that later on. But I wanted to just introduce the concept and introduce the definition at its most basic level. So FEMA defines an agricultural structure as a structure that is used exclusively, key term exclusively, for agricultural purposes or uses in connection with the production, harvesting, storage, raising, or drying of agricultural commodities and livestock. So any structure that does not meet that above definition for any reason must be considered non-agricultural. And like I said, we'll get more in depth in this definition later on. There's a number of other parameters and additional things to consider. But if it does not exclusively pertain to agricultural purposes, it has to be considered a non-residential structure. The other half of this class is accessory structures. These are structures that are on the same parcel of property as a principal structure. The use has to be incidental to the use of the principal structure. It must be used solely for parking or storage. They have to be small and represent a minimal investment by owners. We'll get into that 800 square foot later on, but that's Nebraska's standard. And they have to have low damage potential. And these are also referred to in Nebraska's ordinance as appurtenant structures. So for those of you who have recently reviewed your floodplain ordinance, you've likely seen that term appurtenant structures. That's what we use in our ordinance. It means the same thing as an accessory structure. So just for an example, if you have a primary residential home on a property with maybe a small storage shed in the backyard that's on the same parcel, that would be considered an accessory structure. And like I said, we'll get into that later on. I also wanted to talk about that low damage potential line. So what exactly do we mean by low damage potential? Well, FEMA doesn't necessarily have an exact definition of what low damage potential means. However, they did break it into these categories, and it's up to you as the floodplain administrator of your community or the permitting authority of your community to understand the value of this structure, not just physically, but you also need to understand the contents value and also what it would mean to the property owner if it was no longer able to function with its original purpose. So this is us using our understanding, our local understanding of our community, and using our professional experience to make this determination and to figure out the value of the structure as a whole, not just its physical value. And that's how you want to apply that low damage potential concept. The other thing that we're going to be talking about a lot of is wet floodproofing. Now, a lot of you probably know what this means, at least to some extent. And like I said, we'll get into the technicalities of this later on. But essentially, wet floodproofing is minimizing flood damage to structures by intentionally allowing floodwater to enter and exit automatically without human intervention to minimize unequal pressure of water on walls. So if you think about a structure, it's surrounded by flood water and it's pushing on all sides. The weight of that creates the potential to collapse. Wet floodproofing reduces that risk at the expense of what is contained inside the building. And that's where that low damage potential concept comes into play, right? And all those other regulations we'll talk about later on. You're wanting to use flood damage resistant materials and construction techniques. We'll get into all the technicalities. If you want to know, if you want to get really technical for wet floodproofing, we do have FEMA's technical bulletin on our digital desk reference, which is also where you can find today's source of content, which is floodplain management requirements for agricultural structures and accessory structures. And Michelle has put that link into the chat if you want to access that. This is located in our digital desk reference under floodplain management resources in FEMA Region 7 guidance documents. This is just where we felt it was appropriate on our website for people to find it. The digital desk reference not only contains this guidance, but also all of FEMA's technical guidances, substantial damage guidances, pretty much any guidance that you would be looking for as a floodplain administrator, you can find it in our digital desk reference. So that's a great handy resource, and Michelle has posted that in the chat as well. But this specific guidance clarifies the requirements that apply to agricultural structures and accessory structures that are proposed to be located in special flood hazard areas. So you can find everything that we're talking about today in there, and maybe a little more information if you're wanting to go more in depth. Now, why are we making this distinction in the first place? Why do we need to create the definition for agricultural structures? Why do we need to specify all of these things? So FEMA recognized that their existing guidance at the time did not fully account for the wide range of uses for non-residential structures. Most of the time, floodplain administrators, you're only concerned with residential or non-residential structures and how to permit those. FEMA understood that agricultural structures maybe had different uses that weren't necessarily, that could be their own specific definition away from non-residential structures. There's a multitude of different types of agricultural structures, whether you're using it for storage of equipment, livestock, harvesting products, anything like that. There's all kinds of different types of these structures. And that the specificities of the agricultural industry has changed over the last 25 years, and it was time for a new existing guidance to come into play for agricultural structures and accessory structures. Additionally, this opened up new options for floodplain administrators to permit these structures. So agricultural structures, if they are defined as such, can now be wet flood proofed using variances. Of course, you still need the permit to go along with it, but the variance would allow for wet flood proofing, where elevation or dry flood proofing may not be appropriate in some circumstances. It further defines that accessory structures that are larger than recommended size limits. I mentioned that 800 square foot number earlier on, and we'll get into that later too. If it's larger than those recommended size limits, they can be permitted with variances to be wet flood proofed as well. And lastly, eligible accessory structures can also be wet flood proofed, and they can be wet flood proofed by permit. You don't need a variance for wet flood proofing accessory structures as long as they follow all of the regulations that we're going to talk about today. It's important to remember, I bring up the term variances. Communities that follow FEMA's policies and guidances for granting variances will not jeopardize their standing with the NFIP as long as they are holding to those regulations. The conditions for these variances are very specific, and there's quite a few things that the applicant needs to do, as well as the community, to ensure that they are maintaining the appropriate level of flood mitigation strategies. Before we start getting into the technicalities of everything, one thing that's really important to understand is that these regulations can only be practiced and enforced if they are in your community's floodplain ordinance. Now, for many of you, this language is not in your ordinance yet. Like I said, it's relatively new from the last couple of years. Many of you haven't needed to update your ordinance recently. So this is your opportunity. If your community is interested in including this language in your ordinance for agricultural or large accessory structures, please reach out to me after the presentation and we can begin that process. It's not a difficult process. I would send you our model ordinance that already follows state and federal floodplain management guidelines. And it would include this agricultural and accessory language as optional. You would choose the optional language that you would prefer, and you would send it back to DNR for a review before we give it to FEMA for their final approval. Only once you get that approval can you adopt the new ordinance. But once this language is in your ordinance, you can begin practicing it. If it's not in your ordinance, you can't practice the regulations we're going to talk about today. So let's start digging into it. Let's talk about first permitting agricultural structures. What does that look like? What is the process? Say somebody comes to you with a proposal for a structure that they claim is agricultural. How do we verify that? And how do we go through the permitting process? Well, here's a nice handy flow chart. This is contained in that guidance that we linked to earlier. So if you're looking for this specific flow chart, it's in that guidance. I believe Michelle will also be giving these slides out after the presentation, so you can see this there. But this is just a nice way to form your questioning to figure out if it's an agricultural structure. It's the first thing you want to verify. So you ask yourself first if it's even a structure. Is it walled and roofed? This includes silos and grain bins or elevators. It's a little confusing, but they are technically walled and roofed. It's one continuous wall, but as long as it's walled and roofed, it's considered a structure. If it's not both walled and roofed, maybe it's a pole barn without walls or a livestock pen without a roof, then this is just considered development, and you would permit it to comply with your ordinance as such. If it is a structure, then you ask if it's going to be used for any form of human habitation. Is it going to be used for employment, housing, manufacturing, where you're going to have people involved, or entertainment, where you're going to have people in the structure? If it is going to be used for human habitation, this is considered a non-agricultural structure. This becomes a mixed use structure. It's not being used exclusively for agricultural purposes. So therefore it's a non-agricultural structure, in which case it would need to be elevated or dry flood proofed only. Wet flood proofing would not apply here. If it's not going to be used for human habitation, then you ask, well, what's it going to be used for? Is it going to be specific to agricultural purposes? If not, if this is being used for other purposes, then it does not meet the criteria for an agricultural structure, and again, will likely be required to elevate or dry flood proof. It may qualify as an accessory structure if it meets what we talk about later on. If it meets all three of those requirements, and some additional things we'll talk about later on, then it can be considered an agricultural structure. Those section numbers, if you're a little confused by those are in the guidance. This was pulled directly from that. So that's what those section numbers are referring to. So you've received this application from an individual who's proposing an agricultural structure on their property in the floodplain. So if you've determined that this agricultural structure has met all of those requirements and is, low damage potential, all those kinds of things. Once you've determined the structure meets those criteria, first you want to consider elevating the structure, right? Elevating the structure is your most surefire method to protect a structure from flooding. So you would be elevating in Nebraska that structure to the base flood elevation plus 1 additional foot, which is a minimum standard in Nebraska. Your other option to consider would be dry flood proofing, in which case we are making the structure be watertight and not allowing water in at all to the base flood elevation plus 1 additional foot, or using a combination of both. So you're looking at this application and you're asking yourself, would this be this would be an acceptable method? Would this be better than wet flood proofing, right? You want to consider these options first. Using a combination of both might consist of just elevating a couple of feet and then flood proofing the rest of the way to not allow water in. If neither of those things can be considered, and this is going to cause an exceptional hardship on the applicant, wet flood proofing can be allowed for agricultural structures as long as you're doing it through the variance process. Now, this variance process, and we'll talk about it, like I said, later on, but these variances and the processes that are with them are contained in your floodplain ordinance. So if you're curious about what that process looks like, you can take a look at your ordinance, and that whole process is located there. It's important to remember that when you're wet flood proofing, you're allowing water to pass through the structure. And so if you're going to be wet flood proofing this structure, again, it has to be classified as an agricultural structure, right? It cannot be mixed use. It can't have multiple uses. It can't have human habitants inside. It has to be an agricultural structure only. It also must have low damage potential. And we talked about that before, where you're recognizing what this structure is for and that it's not an extensive cost to the individual who's building it. It's low damage potential for structures, contents, material, and what the actual structure is being used for. It also must not pose risks to public health, safety, and welfare. So that means you can't store volatile or toxic or water reactant materials in this structure, right? Including things like manure, for example. You don't want water flowing through and taking that out of the structure. And finally, they must follow the wet floodproofing requirements that are detailed in your ordinance. Now, this language is in your ordinance for spaces below lowest floor. However, when it's specifically pertaining to agricultural structures, that's how you're going to reach out to us, and we'll provide you with that language to include in your ordinance. It will have the wet floodproofing requirements at that point. And now remember, just because you're granting this variance for the individual to wet floodproof, it still does require the floodplain development permit. And the policy and guidance on all of that process should be in your ordinance again. And if, as long as you follow that guidance, it won't jeopardize your standing with the NFIP. Some additional considerations there. So again, utilities have to be elevated. You can't have water passing through the utilities. And the structure cannot be converted. So you're permitting this structure as an agricultural structure specifically. If that usage is changed, it then has to adhere to those different regulations. So what we're requiring is you're going to have the owner sign a non-conversion agreement that states that they're not going to change the usage of the structure. Say you permitted an agricultural structure to be built in the floodplain, and you proved that it was going to be only agricultural usage. And then you come by later on and you find that they've turned it into some sort of clubhouse or maybe a guest home or something, right? Where people are going to be habitating the structure. At that point, it would be a violation of your ordinance, a violation of your permit, and you would have to go with the appropriate regulations based on what they converted it to. So you have the individual sign a non-conversion agreement, and you want to consider having that non-conversion agreement attached to the property deed so that if it's ever sold, that continues to carry on. And I have an example of a non-conversion agreement later on, so you can see what that might look like, and you can find that in the guidance as well.
Elijah, this might be a good chance to check for questions.
Yes, I saw that.
Okay, good deal. I just didn't want you to get too far past floodproofing before we got to it.
No, thank you for catching me. Let's see. So we often permit wet floodproofing via floodgates. What is an example of dry floodproofing? So dry floodproofing is you're making the structure watertight. So, sealing doors, sealing windows, there's a number of different types of dry floodproofing measures that can be done. But essentially what you're doing is you're sealing all of the openings and constructing at least the lower section of the structure to 1 foot above the base flood elevation to not allow the accumulation of water inside the structure. We have additional technical guidance on our digital desk reference. They'll show you some more examples of actual dry floodproofing systems, types of door seals, and things like that. But that's what dry floodproofing means, is you're making the structure watertight to that base flood elevation plus 1 foot. All right, I think that was our only question for now. Okay. Oh, and dry floodproofing is required for non-residential structures. If it's not an agricultural structure, it can't be wet flood proofed. So it has to be elevated or dry flood proofed, unless it's considered a space below lowest floor. Yeah, you're welcome, Mitch. Thank you for your question. I appreciate that. All right. So here we have an example of an agricultural structure, right? So this is, we'll go through a few of these so you can see what we might be talking about. So this is a large storage structure. Whether it meets that 800 square foot requirement, not really sure. Oh, this is for agricultural structures. Ignore me. This is a large storage structure. In the context of this slide, we can assume that this is being used exclusively for agricultural equipment. You'll see in the bottom right, you have flood vents, which is allowable, like we said, for agricultural structures by variance. So this owner has proved that this was a minimal investment to them. It did not cause additional threats to the community, whatever's being stored in there. and that whatever's being stored in there is exclusively related to agricultural purposes, right? So they've proven all of those things. They've shown that it's an agricultural structure, and that wet flood proofing is pretty much the only option for them. It looks like they may have even elevated slightly to use that mixed mitigation strategy. We'll look at our next one here. So this is a horse barn with some storage on the second floor. So this is a large barn. It's very pretty, very well made. It's hard to tell if this one is wet flood proofed. If I had to take a guess, it looks like it's not. It's important to point out that, you see those doors for the horses to come in and out of the structure. Those are not considered flood openings, right? So those are not a passive system. We talked about wet flood proofing. It has to be the automatic entry of flood and exit of floodwater. So it can't be an active system that requires human intervention. It has to be a passive system. So because these doors would require somebody to open them, they are not considered flood openings. So whether or not this one's actually wet flood proofed, we're not sure. I just wanted to show you an example of what an agricultural structure would look like. So this property owner has proven to the floodplain administrator that this is being used exclusively for agricultural purposes. There's nobody living on that second floor. It's not being rented out for parties or community gatherings where you're going to have human habitation. It's being used exclusively for agricultural purposes. And another example of an agricultural structure that sometimes we really don't think about is our silos and grain elevators. You don't always think about these things as being considered structures, but they are considered walled and roofed, right? It may just be one continuous wall, but it is still walled and roofed. Now that means that these can be wet flood proofed. Now I know that sounds kind of odd because of the things that are normally stored inside of these. It's normally goods and things that you don't want water flowing through. However, it's given as an option because you think about the real world scenario. After a flood, you're driving out in the country or in a rural area, and you see these silos that have a buildup of water around them that have been collapsed or twisted because of the pressure of the water on the outside of them. So what FEMA is saying is that because of that understanding, if you can prove that it's used exclusively for agricultural purposes, these can be wet flood proofed to reduce that static pressure on the outside of the structure, the hydrostatic pressure, to allow the entry and exit of floodwaters. Again, it's not always desirable by the developer because of the things that are being stored in there, but it's definitely something to consider where elevation or dry flood proofing may not be as effective. So what is not an example of an agricultural structure? So here we see a group of structures that are being used to sell goods. Now they may be agricultural specific goods, but because these are being used for some form of human habitation, they're being used for entertainment, being used for sales, these would be considered mixed use and therefore are not exclusively agricultural related. So therefore they have to be either dry flood proofed or elevated to that base flood elevation plus 1 foot. So it's important to make that distinction. And next we're going to talk about accessory structures. Let me grab a drink really quick. So we're going to talk about accessory structures next. That's the other half of this guidance. So we have a very similar flow chart to the one that we saw for the agricultural structures. Again, this is contained in that guidance. So if you want to look for this exact flow chart, you can find it there. And those section references are related to that guidance. But you want to ask yourself again, you've got somebody who proposes an accessory structure on their property. First, you want to ask, is it even considered a structure? So this has to be a walled and roofed structure. So if they're coming in with the application for like a gazebo or something, or a corral, again, that wouldn't count because it's not walled or it's not roofed. So if it's not walled and roofed and it's not a structure, it's just a development and you permit it as such according to your ordinance. If it is, Then you ask if it's going to be used exclusively for parking or storage, right? So that exclusively or solely comes up again. It has to be used solely for parking or storage. If it's not, maybe it's going to be a she shed or a guest living space. That is not considered an accessory structure. So that would have to be permitted as appropriate, maybe as a non-residential structure or residential structure, depending on its usage, in which case they would need to elevate or dry flood proof only. If it is going to be used exclusively for parking or storage, then it's you have to ask if it's an actual accessory structure to the principal structure. So therefore, it has to be on the same parcel of property, and its usage has to be incidental to that primary structure. That means if it's on its own parcel, it's automatically the principal structure, even if it's the same property owner. If it's on a different parcel, it's not considered an accessory structure. It has to be on that same parcel of property. In which case it would be either non-residential or residential, depending on its usage. And if it meets all of those criteria, and there's no question about it, then it's considered an accessory structure, in which case it can either be wet flood proofed, dry flood proofed, or elevated. All three of those options become available. So the same process applies here, right? So again, the generally preferred method is going to be elevation. So if elevation is an option, it should certainly be considered. It must be elevated to exist to the base flood elevation plus 1 foot. That's going to give you the maximum protection from that flooding. The next option would be dry flood proofing, right? So again, making it watertight with flood resistant materials to the base flood elevation plus 1 foot. And of course, the same applies for the agricultural structures, but it has to resist flotation and lateral movement, can't be picked up and moved. Or you can use a combination of both. Of course, you can elevate to a certain elevation and then dry flood proof to that base flood elevation plus 1 foot. And if those can't be considered, then you can consider wet flood proofing. And this is permittable for accessory structures. You don't need a variance for accessory structures to be wet flood proofed. And that's very important for a lot of floodplain administrators. But these accessory structures can be wet flood proofed, and that can be done through a permit. So some additional considerations that you have to take into account. It cannot be larger than a 1-story 2-car garage. In Nebraska, we have verified this with FEMA to be 800 square feet. So it cannot be bigger than 800 square feet. And maybe an example of that would be 25 feet by 32 feet. Just giving an example of a 2-car, 1-story garage. Can't have a second story. It just has to be 1-story, 2-car garage. This size limit would be defined in your ordinance. This is another piece of that language that we would provide to you if you reached out to me with some questions about that. I would provide this language to you, and that 800 square feet would be contained there to find it easily. Any accessory structure that is larger than that 800 square feet would then require a variance to be wet flood proofed. That's when the variance comes into play. Or it should be permitted as a non-residential structure where you're requiring them to elevate or dry flood proof only. And some more additional considerations. Again, if you're wet flood proofing it, the utilities have to be elevated to the base flood elevation plus 1 foot. And again, the structure cannot be converted. So it's the same concept as before. If you're permitting this accessory structure and they've proven it's an accessory structure, and then a few months later you find that they've converted it to something else, that's a violation of your ordinance. So instead of meeting that later on, you want to have them sign a non-conversion agreement and consider having it attached to that property deed. It's just more protection for you. This is an example of what one might look like. I believe this is also contained in that guidance as well. However, I'm sure you can find a copy of your own somewhere. But this is essentially what it might look like. And all you're having them do is fill out this information and sign it. And it states that any alterations or changes from the conditions on the permit would render the structure to be a violation. So this is just an example of what one might look like. So like we did with the agricultural structures, we'll take a look at some examples of accessory structures. So we've got our storage shed. This is a small storage shed. It's clearly not a large investment for the homeowner. You know, it's limited storage of items. We could assume that this is on the same parcel as the principal structure. And you'll notice this one has flood vents, right? So again, wet flood proofing methods are permittable for accessory structures. So this is a perfectly permittable action. No variance required here. And this is an example of a 2-car, 1-story garage. We all know what one looks like, but I just wanted to throw a picture on there. This one, you can see there's no vents or anything on the side. This one hasn't been wet flood proofed. It's likely just a render somebody made online. So, but just to give you an example. So this is a larger example, maybe closer to that 800 square feet. And so this would have to be accessory to the principal structure, not used for human habitation, and either elevated, dry flood proofed, or wet flood proofed. All is permittable. And then again, just another example of a detached garage, less than 800 square feet. Again, needs flood vents here, but this is just an example of what we're talking about. What is not an example of what we're talking about would be something like this, where you have a roofed structure, but it doesn't have walls. So it's not even considered a structure, right? It's roofed, but not walled. So this would have to be permitted as development following your ordinance regulation. So we'll talk next about wet flood proofing requirements for agricultural and accessory structures. We talked a lot about wet flood proofing. Now we'll actually talk about what that means and what that looks like. So essentially what you have is a fully enclosed area below the base flood elevation that is designed to automatically equalize those flood forces by allowing the entry and exit of flood waters. So you have that, you have to have a minimum of 2 openings where the net total area is no less than 1 square inch for every square foot of enclosed space. So it's up to you to decide how many vents that constitutes and what size that is. But it has to be a minimum of 2. The bottom of all openings can't be higher than 1 foot above grade. And the openings can be equipped with screens, louvers, valves, or other coverings, but they still have to allow the automatic entry and exit of floodwaters. It's important to understand that if you're using engineered vents, sometimes they are rated for higher than the square inch size of the vent. And it's important to get the engineering certificate along with those if the individual chooses to use those types of vents. If they're not engineered, then they have to be calculated to the exact square inch of opening. And again, only allowed for storage of materials, parking of vehicles, for structures such as the agricultural or accessory structures. These are our general wet flood proofing regulations. These are already contained in your ordinance now for spaces below the lowest floor. This language would be additional when you reach out to us for the agricultural or accessory language. Here's what that might look like for wet flood proofing. This is an example of a mixed mitigation strategy, right? We talked about that with the dry flood proofing. You can also do it with wet flood proofing. You're wanting to do the minimum or the maximum mitigation possible. So using as much fill as what would be considered appropriate for the structure, and then using flood openings to allow that automatic entry and exit of flood waters. So again, like we said before, wet flood proofing for accessory structures can be done by permit. Again, they have to be smaller than that 800 square feet, be incidental to the principal structure on the same parcel, no larger than the size of a 1-story, 2-car garage, and they have to follow those wet flood proofing construction requirements that we just talked about a couple slides ago. And then for agricultural structures, they can be wet flood proofed only by variance. They still need that floodplain development permit, but they can do the the variance has to go along with that. So again, has to be walled and roofed, has to be a structure, same as for the accessory structure. Has to be used exclusively for agricultural purposes. That low damage potential comes into play again, so it cannot be harmful to the community. And it has to be, you have to consider all the factors, structural, contents, and what it would mean to the community. And it can't pose risks to public health, safety, and welfare. So again, no volatile, toxic materials where you're going to allow water to flow through. Now, before we get into variances, let's see. So Don asked, Nebraska recommends 800 square feet for ag or accessory buildings, but doesn't the county have the final say? You don't find on 800 square foot ag buildings much anymore due to the size of ag equipment. Right, and that's something that when you approach Nebraska DNR and FEMA with an ordinance draft, this is something that we would talk about. Again, Nebraska recommends the 800 square foot as a standard. However, when you reach out to us with your additional or new ordinance language that we would provide to you, this is something that we can talk about. We only permit floodgates up to 400 square feet. Right. And so until you adopt this language into your ordinance, that would be the only allowable circumstance for wet flood proofing. Right. But so if you adopt this language into your ordinance for agricultural or accessory purposes, or for accessory structures, that's when the wet flood proofing becomes available for these types of structures. Thank you for your questions. Okay. So we'll talk now about considering and granting variances. We've talked about it for the agricultural structures or for large accessory structures. Now we'll talk about what it actually means to pass a variance. Okay. So, and all of these, this whole process is going to be in your ordinance too, if you want to look more in depth into it. But variances can only be issued upon a showing of good and sufficient cause by the applicant. If failure to grant the variance would result in exceptional hardship to the applicant, if the development will not result in increased flood heights, if the development will not result in additional threats, right? So it doesn't contain any volatile materials or toxic materials. Is the minimum variance necessary to afford relief? And again, the burden of proof is going to be on the applicant. So if you need additional information to help you make any of these determinations, it should be requested from the applicant. Variances for accessory structures. So this is going to be everything from that last slide, and they have to prove that the structure represents a minimal investment and has low damage potential. So we're talking about variances for accessory structures. So this would be for a structure that's larger than that 800 square feet or larger than that square footage defined in your ordinance that we agree upon. So it has to be low damage potential, is larger than the size limits specified in the ordinance, and then it has to still comply with the wet flood proofing construction requirements that would be in your ordinance as well, that we talked about a few slides ago. For agricultural structures, it's everything from that variance slide, and the structure represents, again, a minimal investment and has low damage potential. They've proven that it's going to be used exclusively for agricultural purposes and complies with those wet flood proofing construction requirements, as well as they've proven, again, it won't cause any additional threats to the community. Everything on that variance slide has to apply here on top of this. So community-wide exceptions. Now we've talked about variances being required when somebody is trying to do something outside of the standards of your ordinance, or if somebody's trying to wet flood proof agricultural structures. So in some cases, FEMA recognizes that due to extraordinary circumstances for some communities, applying those NFIP requirements for elevation or dry flood proofing or wet floodproofing agricultural structures or the size of accessory structures could cause hardship or inequity. So in these cases, FEMA may approve requests that are submitted by communities for an exception to those specific requirements. So these are community-wide exceptions that are granted by FEMA to allow communities to permit specific development without variances. So only for communities with exceptional circumstances, right? So they require a deviation from those minimum standards. Again, the burden of proof lies with the community. FEMA regional offices will monitor the community's compliance with the provisions of the approval, again, if it's approved. We'll talk about the process for applying for this. So what does this mean for agricultural and accessory structures? Well, this would allow the community to permit within the parameters of that community-wide exception. So if they got a community-wide exception for accessory structures larger than that recommended size limit, or for agricultural structures with wet floodproofing measures, you could have a community-wide exception that allows you to permit those practices without the need to pass a variance, unless the structure varies further from that granted exception, right? So it has to be still within those parameters of the community-wide exception. So what does this look like? How do we apply for something like this? So this is just a simple list. Again, you can find more information on this in the guidances, and you can always reach out to FEMA with more questions or reach out to us. But it requires a description of the exception request, the nature, extent of, and reasons for this request, a description of those extraordinary circumstances and the local conditions that would cause hardship, supporting justification. This is going to be all types of studies, environmental, topographic, hydraulic, or hydrologic data that FEMA requests. Supporting information, so FEMA always wants to see what other mitigation strategies are you employing? Are you employing a minimum elevation height, you know, a maximum depth of water on the structure, frequency of flooding, emergency operations plans, you'll want to include those. And are you doing anything to additionally protect the contents and equipment within the structures? And lastly, you have to send them the proposed ordinance language to effectively administer the exception. This language cannot be adopted until the exception is approved. So FEMA will review the request, and they'll work with the community to obtain additional information as needed. DNR will work cooperatively with FEMA to make sure that what they are getting the exception for is acceptable and that the ordinance language meets our state minimum standards. FEMA will then conduct a study to determine the human environment impacts, and then will notify the community of the outcome and will provide guidance as needed. And again, they will monitor the community if it's approved to make sure they are being compliant within the parameters of that community-wide exception. But again, if this community-wide exception is approved, it would allow these types of structures to be permitted without variances. Whether it be a larger than recommended size for agricultural structures or wanting to just permit agricultural structures, accessory structures. Or wanting to permit agricultural structures to be wet flood proofed rather than needing a variance every time. Questions at this time, feel free to type it into the chat or potentially unmute yourself if you have a microphone, but just type it into the chat if you have a question. Otherwise, if you can't think of a question right now, but maybe you have it later on, feel free to message us. Here's our contact information. I'll put it up on the screen. Again, my name is Elijah Kaufman. You can reach out to me for ordinance questions. Otherwise, Chuck and Adele would be happy to provide you with any technical assistance. Michelle York can help you with anything that you might need access to. So just let us know what questions you have or what additional information you need. Okay, Liz asked, when accessory structures are to be anchored, what are some suggested methods? In terms of specific methods for anchoring accessory structures, I would suggest looking in our digital desk reference for some technical guidance for anchoring structures. We have that guidance on our digital desk reference. In terms of specific methods and what would be appropriate, it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. In terms of what should specifically be used, it's kind of hard to say. It kind of depends on the type of structure, its size, what's being stored. But we do have technical guidance on our website. And if you do have an accessory structure that needs to be anchored in some way, this is something that would need to be, you would have to consult with an engineer who would then provide you with the most appropriate form of anchoring for that structure.